Sons-in-law are a very delicate topic, and I am at liberty to say what I wish because none of my sons-in-law are here tonight. In yeshiva, I usually tell the young men that the Lord takes revenge on all children he makes them parents. And to a certain extent, one could say that regarding fathers-in-law and sons-in-law as well. Because the relationship is, we see it in Chumash between Yisro and Moshe. We see it in Tanakh in numerous instances. Chazal always mention it. It can be a stressful relationship, especially if the father-in-law is a very great man. Just as to be the child of a very great father is not always easy. And many times the child is eclipsed by the father. We have numerous examples of that in Jewish history. Rabbeinu Avraham, the son of the Rambam, is such an example. If Rabbeinu Avraham were not the son of the Rambam, he would have the reputation of being one of the greatest of the Rishonim. But because of the fact that he was so overshadowed by his great father, and he devoted much of his scholarship and talents and life to defending and explaining the works of his great father, so the son does not emerge in the greatness that he otherwise would be entitled to. And he himself makes reference to it in a number of comments. Suffice it to say that it is hard to be the son of a great father. The Gaon of Vilna, whose son also, Rabbeinu Avraham, was also a great man, wrote great Sforim, but did not achieve the mark that perhaps otherwise he would have been entitled to, simply because of the fact that his father was the Gaon of Vilna. Because of that, we find in Jewish history, Chazal themselves are magdir, define the matter in the following fashion. They say, Loma einam benet bonim shel talmidei chachomim talmidei chachomim. They say a strange postulate, a strange rule. Why are the children of great Torah scholars not themselves great Torah scholars? The Gemara in the Torah. So the Gemara seems to assume that to be a rule. Otherwise they wouldn't ask, why does it happen? The Gemara takes it almost as a given. So the Gemara gives a moral answer. The Gemara says because Talmidei Chachomim, because of their scholarship, because of their greatness, so many times they are afflicted with arrogance, with hubris. They think too highly of themselves. And therefore the Lord arranges life in such a fashion that great people have to have humbling experiences. There is nothing as humbling as children. And because of that, so Chazal say that that is why the Torah is not hereditary. We find that in Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah says that also clearly. She'eino Yerushalach. The Torah is not something that can be inherited. A child of a wealthy man, at least in one time in our history, stood a chance of also being a wealthy person. But the child of a Talmid Chacham is not necessarily a Talmid Chacham. There is a great exception to this rule that Rashi himself mentions. The exception, Rashi says, are daughters. To be the daughter of a Talmid Chacham, Chazal say that that is the highest of all attainments. Chazal say, Le'olam, the Gemara in Chulin, Le'olam yimkor odom kol ma sheyesh lo v'yelech v'yisol labas Talmid Chacham. A person should sell everything that he has, give up everything in the world if he's looking for a shidduch, and he should marry the daughter of a Talmid Chacham. So Rashi there says that the reason is, and Rashi is speaking of his own experiences in his family. He says because if the husband will die, if the mother's a Bas Talmid Chacham, she'll know how to raise the children. The children will turn out. Which to us at first glance is not the first thing that we think about in life when we arrange shidduchim. We are more optimistic than that. But Rashi is speaking about an occurrence in his own family, where the brother of Rabbeinu Tam, one of Rashi's own grandchildren, predeceased Rashi, died before his grandfather died. And he had a large family, he had 7 children, the oldest of whom was 8 when he died. And his widow, who was a daughter of Rashi's famous disciple, Rabbeinu Shmaya, whom I will discuss tonight, I hope. So this daughter of Rashi's Talmud, Rabbeinu Shmaya, she raised all 7 children to be great Talmidei Chachomim. And in the Balei Tosfos call her the menorah, called the woman, the menorah, that she was the candelabra because she had 7 lights that shone from it. So when Rashi says that comment, why one should marry a Bas Talmid Chacham, Rashi is talking about himself. The other Meforshim say a much more esoteric, perhaps more acceptable interpretation, that the daughter of a Talmid Chacham has within herself those qualities of Torah and of fear of heaven and of moral behavior and of modesty and compassion, which are necessary in order to build a Jewish home. And therefore a person should sell everything that he has in order to marry a Bas Talmid Chacham. And the Meforshim also explain that a Bas Talmid Chacham is someone who realizes that she's a Bas Talmid Chacham, because it carries the responsibility with it. Rashi had 2 daughters, perhaps a 3rd daughter. We don't know. His oldest daughter was named Miriam, and his 2nd daughter was named Yocheved. There is a theory among scholars that he had a 3rd daughter named Esther. If he did, we know nothing about her, nor whom she married. Most scholars feel that it's unlikely that there was such a 3rd daughter, because the Jewish community in Ashkenaz and France then was very small. I mentioned before, 5,000 to 10,000 Jews total. You're talking about a few hundred families. Everybody knew everybody. And from the tshuvas, from the responsa, from the letters of the time, everybody is mentioned. You'll add up all the Balei Tosfos, there are about 650 names, so you met everybody that there was to meet. And if there would have been another son-in-law of Rashi, or if there would have been other grandchildren of Rashi, it's logical to presume that somehow we would have heard about them. But these 2 daughters we know about. And Rashi raised the 2 daughters as though they were sons. And that has happened many times in Jewish history, that when a great scholar, a great Talmid Chacham, a great Rav, is many times blessed with daughters and not with sons, so he gave his daughters the same education that he would have given his son. And therefore the daughters of Rashi, you are talking here, my friends, in the 11th century. In the 11th century, not only were women illiterate, because women were illiterate in Europe almost till the 19th century, and in Eastern Europe, most of our great-great-grandmothers could neither read nor write, nor did anyone feel a necessity for them to be able to read or write. And that's among the Jews, the people of the book. But generally in the Middle Ages, there was no station in life worse than being a woman, generally speaking. And women never, with rare exceptions, were granted the ability to have any sort of education. And we're talking here about noble women, about queens, about countesses. We're not talking only about the peasant women. They were all illiterate. As late as the Elizabethan age, in the 17th, the 16th and 17th centuries, special tutors were hired to teach Queen Elizabeth, for instance, how to sign her name correctly. So that on the royal decrees, which you can see in the British Museum, the name would look presentable. It wouldn't look like chicken scratches. So in the 11th century, you have a man that lives in this little town of Troyes in France, and he has two daughters. And he took the two daughters and made them into Torah scholars, so that they were his secretaries. And much of what Rashi wrote was written by his daughters in their hand, and it explains slightly at least how Rashi could be so prodigious in his output, because in effect he dictated. And his daughters wrote down what he said, and they are the ones that helped promulgate his great commentary. So he had to find proper mates for his daughters, which is not always an easy thing. Chazal always say that the genius of a woman is to make her husband feel as though he is in control, even though we all know that the reality is far different. But the wise woman is the one that allows, I always tell a joke, which gets less and less funny, that a man died and he went to heaven. And when he came to heaven, he saw that there were two gates to heaven. And one of the gates had a sign on it that said, "This gate is for all husbands who were dominated by their wives." And he saw there's a very, very long line waiting to get in at that gate. He looked around at the second gate, he said, "This gate is for all husbands who are not dominated by their wives." He turns around, he sees there's only one person waiting at the gate. So he goes over to him and he sees it's his old friend Yankel. So he says to him, "Yankel, what are you doing standing here?" He says, "I don't know, my wife told me to stand here." So there's a genius that Chazal said, "Nechos darka u'neso vitzisa." Marry a woman that gives you the impression that it's nechos darga, that she's a level lower than you, because the masculine ego is very, very fragile, very brittle. And because of that, therefore, part of the accommodation that God made was that women are able to convey that sense, even though the women are the ones that build the family. When it comes to take a son-in-law, a husband for his daughter, so then Rashi has to find special people. And he found two such people. His first daughter, Miriam, married Rabbi Yehuda ben Nosson, or Benatan. There's a family till today, Benatan, an old family within the Jewish people. They are all descended from Rashi's daughter. They're all descended from the Rivon, Rabbi Yehuda ben Nosson. Rabbi Yehuda ben Nosson was a Talmud of Rashi, and who we have the prototype of what happened many, many times over in Jewish history, is that the head of the yeshiva, or the head of the school, or the rabbi, looked around and picked out, so to speak, in his school, in his academy, in his yeshiva, he picked out the young man whom he felt could be his heir, could be a member of his family, would be most likely to succeed with his daughter, and made him an offer that he could not refuse. And that became traditional and remains traditional until today. That the head of the yeshiva, one of the perks, one of the advantages, so to speak, is that in the yeshivas they say that you cannot pick your sons, but at least you can pick your sons-in-law. That doesn't mean that one always picks correctly, nor does it mean that one always does pick one's sons-in-law. But generally speaking, in the history of Torah at least, that has been the rule rather than the exception. Because of that, we have dynasties within the Jewish people. You have families that constantly renew themselves. If they don't renew themselves internally, then they renew themselves externally by always bringing in the best students and making them parts of their family so that the tradition of Torah would go on. The famous anecdote, again, the anecdote is told about many Roshi yeshivas, so I don't know which one to credit it to. And it really doesn't make any difference, and it doesn't make any difference how accurate it is either, but it characterizes the situation. That he once came to a yeshiva, and he told the Rosh Yeshiva, I'm looking for a son-in-law, and show me the best 5 that you have. So they sent in the best 5 students, and the rabbi had a long conversation with them, and he posed a certain problem in halacha, problem in the Talmud. And he said, who can answer this question? And all 5 attempted, and none of them succeeded. The rabbi closed the book, he got up, and he said, nice to meet you, and he left. He got on his horse and wagon, and he was leaving. After he had proceeded a few hundred yards down the road, he turned around, and he saw that one of the young men was pursuing the horse and wagon. So the driver said, should I stop? He said, no. He says, there's no reason that they had enough time to think about it. It's too late now. I don't want to hear his answer. But the young man kept on persisting and pursuing the wagon until finally the horse driver took pity on him and he stopped the horse and wagon. And breathless, the young man came up to the Rosh Yeshiva in the wagon. He said, listen, Rabbi, he said, so you're not going to give me your daughter, but tell me the answer at least. And the Rosh Yeshiva said, oh, you're my man. That's what I'm looking for. But that has been a tradition within the Jewish people, and Rashi is the one, I don't say that started the tradition, but Rashi is probably the most famous practitioner of that tradition. So the Rivon was handpicked by Rashi. He was Rashi's student. Now Rashi had 3 main students. One was Rabbi Shmaya, whom I mentioned to you before, who became the father-in-law of Rashi's grandson. Rashi's family is like a Havdalah candle. It is so twisted and turned all within each other that after a while it's almost impossible to be able to differentiate unless one is a genealogical expert. But Rabbeinu Shmaya was Rashi's Talmid Muvak. He was his disciple. He wrote down every word that the Rebbe said. And for instance, therefore, the gaps that we have in Rashi to the Talmud, there are certain gaps where the Pirush Rashi doesn't appear. Most of the gaps are filled by the commentary of Rabbeinu Shmaya, because the scholars felt that Rabbeinu Shmaya is not telling you his own interpretation, he's telling you Rashi. So Rashi didn't write it, but his Talmud, Rabbeinu Shmaya, wrote it. And Rabbeinu Shmaya studied with Rashi for, it is estimated, 35 years. And he had no other life but Rashi. And he is quoted by all of the Ashkenazic Rishonim, Kach ro'isi b'kum truso shel Rabbeinu Shmaya, Talmido shel Rabbeinu Shlomo. This is what I saw in the notebook of Rabbi Shmaya, the disciple of Rabbi Shlomo, the disciple of Rashi. So if Rabbeinu Shmaya said it, it is 100% that he heard it from Rashi. So here we have one example of the great Talmud, of the great disciple, but there's no originality. Rabbeinu Shmaya never said anything else. He only said what he heard from Rashi. The Talmud tells us about Tanoim, Shelo Omar Dover Shelo Shoma Mipi Rabba. He never said over anything that he didn't hear from his Rebbe. That was one style of learning. Rabbi Eliezer HaGodol, the Gemara says, the great Rabbi Eliezer, the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, the last of the Talmidim of the house of Shammai, a man that was so strong that he stood against all of the Chachomim in his age. When the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived really in one of the worst periods in Jewish life, his rule was that if the Rebbe didn't say it, then there's nothing I can say. So you have many times in the Gemara, they asked him a question and he doesn't answer. So the Gemara says, why doesn't he answer? Because his Rebbe never was asked a question. And he never said anything he didn't hear from his Rebbe. In our time, we have had that tradition also, especially, for instance, in the family of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker. So they say over, Reb Chaim Brisker had a Talmud, Reb Baruch Ber Leibovitz, the Rosh Yeshiva of Kamenetz, one of the great Gaonim. So they say that not only did he say over what Reb Chaim said, but when Reb Chaim sneezed, he sneezed in the same spot. And when he said it over, so he said, here the Rebbe sneezed, here the Rebbe coughed. That's one school. In Torah, there are many, many streams in the great river of tradition. Another school was that he studied by the Rebbe, and he attempted to take everything that he could from his great teacher, and then he made his own way. He was mechadesh, he was an ingenious person, an inventive person, an imaginative person, and he went his own way. So the Rabbeinu Shmaya was the first type of person. That he took over from Rashi everything, and that was it. Rashi's sons-in-law were not that way. Rashi's sons-in-law took over everything they could from their great teacher and father-in-law, but they made their own way. They criticized some of the things that he said, they disagreed with him. Sometimes they even patronized him, as we'll see in a moment. Everything that happens in a family. Because when one is younger, one always knows more. I always tell the boys in the yeshiva that they should realize that they will never again be as intellectually bright and as smart and know as much about life as they do when they're 15. From then on, it's downhill all the way. And so the same thing happened here, this type of situation. So Rashi's sons-in-law, the first one that we're talking about, Reb Yehuda ben Nosson, the Rivon, they were independent. They went their own way. They disagreed many times with Rashi. Rashi had a second Talmud, aside from Rabbeinu Shmaya. The man is called Rabbeinu Simcha, and he lived in a town, Vitry, in France, V-I-T-R-Y. The town still exists today, but it is noted for nothing. But it has survived in Jewish literature and rabbinic literature because he wrote a book called Mavzor Vitry. Now the word Mavzor that we have that refers to the prayers for holidays, originally it comes from the word Mavzor, meaning to go around, to return the cycle of the year. That's why it's called a Mavzor. But the original Mavzorim in Ashkenazi Jewry were not simply prayer books. They were books of halacha regarding the Yomim Tovim, regarding the whole cycle of everyday life, from the beginning of birth till the end, and every day of the year. The Mavzor Vitri is a diary of Rashi. What Rashi did, what he didn't do. So there are fascinating things in the Mavzor Vitri. The Mavzor Vitri, for instance, brings that once the Seder in Rashi's house was so late that Rashi forgot to eat the Afikoman. You hear that? Rashi forgot to eat the Afikoman. If the Mavzor Vitri wouldn't say it, I wouldn't dare say it. But Rashi wasn't nervous about it. They told him about it in the morning that we forgot the Afikoman. So he said, we'll eat it next year. Which gives us a clue into Rashi. He writes there that the reason they did, Rashi loved his grandchildren as every grandparent does. The Mavzor Vitri said in the Sefer Orah it's brought, the Sefer Orah was also written by a Talmud of Rashi. So he writes that Rashi would come to shul and the grandchildren, he would ride them on his neck. In other words, he put the child on his neck so that the child's feet hung over Rashi, and that's how he'd come into shul. That's how he would come to shul, he said, always with the grandchildren around his neck. So Rashi said, you know, that Pesach, the Seder, according to Chazal, the Seder is for the children, not for the adults. There are many rules in life that we forget. When I first opened the yeshiva in Monsey, so the great, clever, and really astute Jew, Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky, Zechat Tzadik L'Vrocha, so I went to him for some advice and for a blessing. So he said, you should remember one thing. He said, a hospital should be made for the patients, not for the doctors. A yeshiva is made for the students, not for the teachers. Simple rule, right? You try and enforce it. It's 15 years that I'm fighting the battle. We've made a lot of progress, but we're still not there. Because the nature of an educational institution, it's for the faculty, it's for the dean, it's for everybody else but for the poor sucker that has to come and learn there. The Seder was made for the children. That's what it says in the Gemara. Kan Aben Shoel. All the minhagim are made for the children. So, but the children are a pain. They can't sit long, and they make trouble, and they make noise, and everything, right? And we want to say this great piece of Torah that I've been preparing for a whole year to say at the Seder night. Rashi never lost sight of what the purpose was. So he had the children, and with the whole tumult with the children, they forgot to eat the afikoman. From there I have a proof that the children did not steal the afikoman at the time of Rashi. Either that or Rashi wouldn't ransom it. Maybe that's why he didn't eat the afikoman. But in any event, we have a picture of Rashi as a father and as a grandfather. We have in Rashi's tshuvas that he wrote to his sons-in-law. I want to quote here the Loshon that I saw it today. I think it's most impressive because again it says who Rashi was. He ends. He doesn't end the way most rabbinical tshuvas end, with a great deal of standard pious sayings. He says, Yechi chasni Reb Meir lo'ad. May you, my son-in-law, Reb Meir, live forever. In biti, together in happiness with my daughter, v'hayolodim, and the dear children, she'yenuvum b'seiva v'sholom, that they should live to great old age into peace. That's how Rashi wrote the truth. In today's world, there are many that are afraid to admit that they have children or grandchildren, that somehow it would take away from the seriousness of the response, of the halachic response. Rashi never felt that way. Whenever you see Rashi, you always see him as a father, as a grandfather, as a father-in-law. Rashi saw himself in no other role. The Rivon studied under Rashi, and the Rivon, together with his wife Miriam, helped write many of the commentaries of Rashi. Most of the Meforshim agree that, for instance, the last 4 pages of Rashi's commentary to Makos is the Rivon. It's not Rashi, it's the Rivon, because we have manuscripts of the Rivon that are identical, and the quotations that are attributed to Rashi we do not have in our Rashi. So again, how that happened is not clear. It could be the copyist's error, it could be the printer's decided, it could be that Rashi didn't finish. In our Gemara it's written, Rashi, Gufo Tohor, Rashi was pure of body, V'nishmoso yotza b'tahara, and his soul, he expired in impurity, and he did not have time to finish these last 4 pages. But it doesn't say who finished them. But we now know that his son-in-law, the Rivon, finished them. The Rivon wrote, he said, my father-in-law can put into 5 words what it takes me 50 to do. There is no one the master of conciseness that Rashi is. The Rivon, however, said that my father-in-law did not approach the commentary as literally as he should have. And that there are many things in the commentary, he said that if I would have to do it, I would do it differently. And he did do it differently. We have fragments, the 18 Masechtos of the commentary of the Rivon. It's based on Rashi. In fact, 95% of it is Rashi, if not verbatim, but certainly the same interpretation. But there's 5% in which he says, my father-in-law missed it. It's not right. It's not what it should be. Rashi accepted it from his sons-in-law, as we'll see in a moment when we discuss his other son-in-law, Rabbi Meir. Rashi accepted both from his sons-in-law and his grandchildren their criticism, and many times he agreed with them and told them that they should change his commentary according to their understanding. You look in the Rashbam, the Rashi's grandson, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, in the beginning of Gracious. So he says there, I discussed this verse with my grandfather, and I told him, he was 15 years old, the Rashbam. He's talking to Rashi. And I told him, Zayde, you were wrong. And he said, Vahodoli. And he agreed with me. And he said that I should write differently. Again, you have a picture of Rashi. Somebody else would say, Chotzef. But you're talking about different types of people. And Rashi looked to develop independence. The whole greatness of the Balei Tosfos of his family was that they were independent people. Independent thinkers, independent doers, and Rashi is the one that gave them the motivation. Rashi's second son-in-law, Rabbeinu Meir, came from Alsace-Lorraine, which is German, French. It's always been a source of contention. Today it is French again. In Hebrew, they called it Lotar. Well, just as an aside, none of the names that appear in the manuscripts of the Ashkenazim, of the names of the towns that they came from, none of the names are accurate. They purposely changed the non-Jewish name of the town because they didn't want to speak the way the non-Jews spoke. So there is not one town, with the exception of Paris, but otherwise, none of the towns have the same name. And therefore, instead of calling it Lorraine, they called it Lotar. They made their own names. The Jews did the same thing in Spain. It's a Jewish custom. The Jews in Eastern Europe did the same thing as well. They did not call it by the Polish name necessarily or by the Lithuanian name, but they made it their own name. But you have the famous city of Toledo in Spain. The Jews called it Tudela. We have a street here at the beginning of Rechavier, Binyamin Tudela. It should be Toledo, but they didn't want to call it Toledo. They called it Tudela. And you have countless other examples throughout the Middle Ages and later in Eastern Europe where the Jews purposely distorted the name in order to make it Jewish. I think that that's the origin of why on the Lower East Side in the city of New York, Sam Houston is called Houston. Because Jews, by definition, somehow always have changed it. They didn't want to call it by that name. So he came from this town of Lotha, he came from this area of Lorraine, the Rabbeinu Meir, and he also studied under Rashi. Rashi saw in him genius, and he was a very young boy. So Rashi said to him, you know, it's a waste of time for you to learn by me. Go to my Rebbe. My old Rebbe is still alive, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Azoke. The old Rabbi Yitzchak, whom Rashi had learned under 30 years earlier, 20 years earlier. He said he's still alive. He has the yeshiva in Worms. And go to him and study under him. Why should you learn, Rashi said, from a secondary source when you can learn from the primary source? Which also, sometimes the son not found, very rarely will a mentor send away potentially the star student to study somewhere else. We all become very possessive of students that show great promise, that have great ability. And here he sent them away, but he sent them to his mentor. And therefore, he studied under the old Rabbi Yitzchak. When he became 22 years old, so then Rashi took him as a son-in-law to his daughter Yocheved. Rabbeinu Meir was much more assertive a personality than his brother-in-law in the Rivon. And Rabbeinu Meir is called the Avi HaRabbonim, the father of the great rabbis, because his three sons, he and Yocheved, had the three sons that are the founders of the school of the Tosafists. Rashi's three grandchildren, the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Meir, the Rivom, Rabbeinu Yitzchak ben Meir, and finally Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Meir, who is called Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, the Rabbeinu Tam. All three of these sons were enormous geniuses, great personalities, different individuals, and they had in themselves the personality of their father, Rabbeinu Meir. Rabbeinu Meir writes many times, Hisvakachti imchasni. I discussed this with my father-in-law, and I told him that the custom is not the way he says. He also says that many times, he said, my father-in-law says that Rabbeinu Yitzchak said thus and thus. He said, when I was in the yeshiva, Rabbeinu Yitzchak didn't say that. He said something else. So Rashi answered him, well, maybe he changed his mind. You saw him 20 years later. So Rabbeinu Meir says, I'm not always sure which custom to follow. But he, at the end, says, a very interesting, revealing letter. At the end, he says that even though I feel that halachically I'm correct, but he said, if Rashi instituted that custom among the Jews of France, he said, I will not change it. His son, however, the Rabbeinu Tam, will say, if I feel I'm correct, I'll stand the world on its head. We're going to change it. But that we'll talk about next week, God willing, about the Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam. But they had their father's independence. They had their father's strength of purpose and of character. And it is remarkable, therefore, that Rashi had two sons-in-law who were able to, so to speak, to grow out of his shadow and to become the leaders of French Jewry and not be so overwhelmed by the fact that they had Rashi, who was, no words to describe, the greatest of the Jews that we've had. They were not overwhelmed by it. They were able to be themselves. Rabbeinu Yehuda ben Nosson, the Rivon, we do not know what he did for a living. We have no clear indication. But Rabbeinu Meir, we know, was a banker. A banker, if you want to use a pejorative term, so you say he was a money lender. If you want to use a complimentary term, then you say he's a banker. This was in the Middle Ages also, the two-edged sword. The bankers on one hand had a great deal of respect within the community. They were wealthy and powerful and influential. On the other hand, because of the nature of usury in the Middle Ages, the average interest rate in the Middle Ages was 35%. And the reason that it was because the risk of non-payment was so high, and the liabilities were, the collateral rather, was always tenuous. So because of that, it was a terribly usurious rate of interest. Because of that, they were viewed many times as being sachtanim, of being people who squeezed others. Now, the Jewish people were forced into money lending because of the church's piety. The church adopted a rule in the early Middle Ages that the church always attempted to portray themselves as being the true Jewish people. Even till today, the Roman Catholic Church in its emblem has in Latin, true Israel. They're the real Israel. Jews for Jesus was invented a long time ago. And they said they're the real Jews. This is essential to Christian theology because of the fact that otherwise they have the problem, what happened to all of the mitzvot? How did Saturday become Sunday? And what happened to circumcision and kashrus and everything else? So they have to say that everything was canceled. The Old Testament was old, and there was a New Testament. And the New Testament abrogated all of the old mitzvahs, but what it did is choose a new Israel. And the new Israel is the church. It's Christianity. But however, in order to support that idea, they kept some of the mitzvah, they kept some of the ritual of the Jewish people. I don't know if you've ever had a chance, but if you'll see a picture of the Pope of Rome and his garments, you'll see that in a slightly distorted fashion, they are the imitation of the Big Day Kahuna of the Kohen Gadol. They're the high priest's vestments. Many other things that the church has are relics of the fact that one way or another they are our offspring. Even moasu abonim hoisol arosh pino. The, so to speak, the scrap, the garbage that fell off of our table is the centerpiece of world civilization. What there isn't in one mitzvah or in one tasteless. I heard this from Rabbi Soloveitchik, who should live and be well. So somebody was discussing with him a great idea about Kant. He's a Kantian philosopher. So they discussed with him this great concept for about a half hour, and it was a religious Jew that was discussing with him, and Rabbi Soloveitchik's final remark was, he says, but all of it, he said, is not worth one good kasha in Tosfos. Doesn't come to one good question in Tosfos. So in such a situation, the church said, Christians are not allowed to take interest from other Christians because the Christians are the Jews. And in the Torah it says that you shall not take interest one brother from another. And therefore, how can the Christians take interest one from another? The church had and has no concept of halacha, of understanding how to develop the halacha, of understanding how one can run a modern economy without violating any of the rules of the Torah, which we are able to do. So the church took it literally, and as many times the church painted itself into a corner. The land of Israel is a problem for the church. They painted themselves into a corner. It's a theological problem. It's not a political problem. It's not a diplomatic problem. Asking the church to recognize that the Vatican should recognize the state of Israel is tantamount to telling them to admit that they're wrong for 2,000 years. It's not likely to happen. Because according to Christian theology, we are not allowed to be here. It cannot be. The great thing about Judaism is that about nothing does it say it cannot be. We say everything can happen. It's not a kasha. We have no dogmas. We're not bound to any. But here you have an infallible statement that the Jewish people will never return to the state of Israel, to the land of Israel, and certainly will never have sovereignty, and certainly not have sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem and the Christian holy places. You have to understand what a bird that is under the saddle of the church. Why is it the Pope has visited 60 countries? You know, they can't get an El Al ticket. One would think that he would want to see the holy places. So when he gets off in Poland, he bends down and kisses the ground at the Warsaw airport. He would be hard-pressed to do that here. Especially because they would probably send Shalom et Aloni to greet him. So the church said Christians cannot take interest one from another. But it's impossible to run any sort of an economy. And as the Western Europe began to develop, the Western civilization began to develop in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, so the idea of credit, the idea of different currencies, all of the modern ideas which fuel our economy today, to the extent that even that money is passé today, and that we're all dealing only in abstract ideas. So if you study the Gemara Bava Metzia, if you study the 4th and 5th Prokim, Azov and Ezeu Neshech, you'll see that Chazal discussed all of the modern concepts of economics. The fact that money per se is not a value, it's what people say it's worth. The whole concept that binds our economies together today, and the whole concept of credit. The church had none of that. So the church said, well, we'll solve two problems with one solution. And the two problems are, A, what are the Jewish people still doing here? Which is a problem that the church has never faced up to. So alternately they have tried to convert us and kill us and exile us. But it's a problem because, again, according to theology, we should not have survived. The second problem is, how do we lend money? How do we get money flowing through Europe? So they solved both problems by saying, oh, that's why the Jews are here. Because the Jews are going to be our Shabbos goy. If you'll think about it, you'll see that that's exactly the same situation. Every Jewish community had, or Jewish homes had a non-Jew that came in, he turned on the lights for you, he did something. So that's the same thing that we have, the church said. That's what the Jews are here for. So what happened was that the nobleman, or the king, lent money to the Jew at 30% interest. The Jew then turned around and lent that money, which is just like modern banking, the numbers are different. But it's the same thing. You put money in a bank, and the bank turns around and lends it to somebody else. The bank hopefully makes 2 or 2.5 or 1.5% in the middle, and if everybody keeps on paying, so then you make a profit. So the Jew turned around and he took the money that he had borrowed at 30% and he lent it to other non-Jews at 35% or at 40% or whatever the risk was in order to be able to make a profit. And that's how Jews came into the money lending business in Europe. And for almost 300 years, from about the year 1000 till the beginning of the 100-Year War, till about 1330, the Jews were the bankers in Europe. From 1330 on, the church itself figured out that they could be the banker. They could make the 3% in the middle. And the church, by definition, is excluded from all of the laws of religion. And therefore, the church became the biggest banker in Europe. And then finally, when Europe no longer was frum, so then everybody became bankers. But for over 3 centuries, the Jews were the bankers. So Rabbeinu Meir was a banker. And a banker was a prestigious and important position in the Jewish community, but it also was, I mentioned, fraught with danger. And we'll see that his son, Rabbeinu Tam, who inherited his father's banking business, was almost killed because of the fact that so many non-Jews owed him money that they decided that the best way to get rid of the debt would be to get rid of the creditor. And since in the Middle Ages killing a Jew had almost no legal liability, no responsibility attached to it, so it was a very dangerous job. The second field of parnosa that the Rabbeinu Meir had was that he went into his father-in-law's business, which is also something that happens to Jewish sons-in-law, and he went into the wine business. And by the end of his life, he owned or had rights to large amounts of vineyards in the Champagne area of France. The Jews manufactured wine, not just for themselves, but they manufactured wine for the non-Jewish community as well. And you'll find, therefore, in Tosfos and Avodah Zarah, where all of the prohibitions regarding non-Jewish wine are discussed, or wine that non-Jews touch, etc., you'll find there Tosfos discusses the matter at greater length than anyone else, and comes up with all sorts of ingenious solutions, and brings all sorts of problems. For instance, if the non-Jew puts a spigot into the barrel, what does that do to the wine that's in the barrel? He never touched the wine, but he put the spigot into the barrel to be able to draw the wine. Tosfos discusses that happened every day. Tosfos discusses picking up the barrels and putting them on carts, etc., etc. Tosfos there mentions that many pious rabbis had only Jewish help in the wineries. But if you wanted to have a big winery, which apparently the Rabbeinu Meir had, then you already had to have non-Jewish help. So then you had to devise a system by which you could have wine that Jews could drink, and yet the majority, the bulk of the produce would be sold on the non-Jewish market to the general population. From all appearances that we see, Rabbeinu Meir was a wealthy man. And his children were wealthy. And he had a great deal of pride in his 3 sons. And I mentioned his middle son, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, died at a very early age. And he died before his grandfather, before Rashi died. And he was called in rabbinic literature Avi HaRabbonim, the father of all of the rabbis, because the main rabbis of France were his sons and Rashi's grandsons. Next week, God willing, we'll discuss 2 of the grandsons, the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam, who have left their imprint upon us. And I hope also to be able to share with you next week some insights as to how the grandchildren saw their grandfather and how to a great extent they rebuilt their grandfather's image in their own image so that their time would be able to appreciate Rashi. I would say that if we're not for Rashi's grandchildren, Rashi would not have achieved the universal popularity and acceptance that he has. His grandchildren were the ones that said, you want to learn Chumash, you have to learn it with Rashi. You want to learn Talmud, you have to learn it with Rashi. We'll see a letter that Rabbeinu Tam wrote to Spain, and he wrote to the great Talmidei Chachamim in Spain, and he said to him, you don't know how to learn because you don't learn with Rashi. He's writing to Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. How can you learn without Rashi? So his Rashi's grandchildren, you're looking here at a corporation, right? Rashi's grandchildren put the final touches on Rashi and made him the commentator to the Bible, to the Talmud, to all of Jewish life. Thank you.